Anyway, let me introduce Nick Walker. You see him there on your, can everyone see him there on the screens? Yeah. Okay, good. Why are you laughing, Alex?
You just pulled a funny face, it made me giggle.
Nick or me?
I mean, I'm not going to answer that one. I'm just going to mute.
Yeah, okay. It must be Nick because I've always got a funny face. So there you are. Anyway, Nick's a local writer. I don't know. You're not from Coventry, are you originally?
Not originally, but I've been here for so long, may as well be. Yeah,
I've been there a long time. So you must have sinned in your past life like me. Yes. But anyway, he was very much a theatre writer, and then became a novelist, short story writer, radio drama producer in particular. You've got a little company called Top Dog Productions, I believe. Is that still running?
I believe that still exists, although, yeah, I'm not part of them anymore. But yeah, that was the
you're not part
of it. Yeah.
Okay. So he's the lost dog, not the top dog. He's been working, he's produced, many shows for both the theatre and also for radio and television. He's working on a TV show at the moment. He's up in Scotland. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the show you're working on at the moment before we begin, Nick?
Well, it's just it's like a new crime drama series for like a 6-part drama series for it's Alibi over here and PBS in America and ABC in Australia, and it's an adaptation of a radio show that I did, which was also called Annika. So essentially, it's an interesting thing. You don't often get that transfer from radio over into television, but there's such an appetite for crime at the moment. And if you can be part of a production that can be COVID safe and filming, they were one of the first industries to get back up and running. So that's happening at the moment. We're halfway through a 16-week shoot, and I think because everyone's so desperate for content, it will be out. I think it's this summer that it comes out. So it's a really, really quick turnaround. So it's not going to sit on the shelf for years, which is what some of them do. It's great. So it stars Nicola Walker, for any Nicola Walker fans. And it's looking really good, actually. I get the daily rushes and I'm really happy with it. But it's that's happening now. And I think everyone up there is just glad to be working, frankly, and to be with other people. So although everyone's like in full PPE, apart from when you say action and then the masks come off for the actors, it's not bad.
The masks off will probably seem a bit unrealistic by summertime.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. We're in a world now where we're pretending that it does not exist. Yeah. Well, at some point it won't. So.
But anyway, we're really lucky to have Nick here today because there's a little break in his filming schedule. So, and he's come to talk to you today about horror. He's also going to come back in 2 or 3 weeks' time and talk about contemporary crime, aren't you? Is that right?
That's right.
Good. Yeah. I think I've sent you the date. So
yes. Yeah.
So Nick will be back.
Cool.
And let's just start then. Nick's going to talk to you today about contemporary horror writing. I'll say nothing. We're hoping to finish this session by 3 o'clock. Nick hopefully will finish a little bit earlier, so there's time for Q&A, a few questions. And then I think you all will be performing a little crime performance for me, a whodunit that you've written. Is that right? Yeah. Have you done that? Yeah. Okay, so we've got a couple of live whodunits afterwards, so I'm looking forward to
Amazing.
Okay, so Nick, it's all yours. I'm going to shut up now. Can everyone mute the microphones? And it's over to Nick.
So I'm going to share this screen just so that I can just run through this slideshow from beginning. Okay, so we're on the genre fiction word. Let me just get rid of this up here. So yes, so Yeah, we're in the contemporary horror subject today, and we're going to look at sort of two main areas. We're going to look at folk horror, and we're going to look at eco horror particularly. But we're also going to look a little bit about how they work. We're going to look at the characteristics of each of those two subgenres, and we're also going to look at how some of the shared characteristics they have, which will be a little overview of the new uncanny as it relates to contemporary horror, but also how that relates to the sort of like the old the old Freud normal uncanny, a bit of that. We'll have a look at some of structurally how some of those things work. We'll just touch on that, which is around sort of structures of tension and suspense. And then we'll have a little look at just fear, which essentially is just at the root of most of it. We won't go too into that. There's enough fear anyway, but essentially it's interesting to look at some of those areas around what sort of initiates this move into contemporary horror. So to kick off then with folk horror, I'm going to show you a little clip which I mean, may or may not work. If it doesn't, not too well, but it sort of sets the scene. This is a little clip, the trailer for the Wicker Man of 1973, but it sort of sets out the territory, I think.
Just to say, we're getting no sound, Nick. Have people got sound? Nobody's got sound. No. You might have to share your sound on the screen. There's probably a button.
I am here to investigate the disappearance of a young girl. Where is Rowan Morrison?
If Rowan Morrison existed, we would know.
I suspect murder.
But Sergeant, I've already told...
In the name of God, woman, what kind of mother are you? That can stand by and see your own child slaughtered.
You are the fool, Mr. Harry.
You're liars. You are despicable little liars.
If Rowan Morrison existed, we would know.
I suspect murder.
She was burned.
You are the fool, Mr. Harry.
Where is Rowan Morrison?
Oh my God!
We can't hear you now, Nick.
Okay, so yeah, now how's now?
Yeah, perfect.
Brilliant. Yeah. I think this is okay. So yeah, so right. Hang on a minute. Why isn't it letting me? Okay, hang on a sec. Screen sharing stopped as the shared window is closed. Okay, right. Let's start this again. So yeah, The Wicker Man is one of these examples of a sort of 1970s horror film, which folk horror film, which sort of sets out the territory that we'll be exploring kind of through through the rest of the lecture, and it sort of sets out its story, these kind of pagan rituals. There are lots of sort of, you know, animal heads there. There's the sort of fish out of water, the kind of outsider coming in, and there's the this sort of bucolic surrounding, so this sort of beautiful kind of island in Scotland, which, you know, it looked like it was very cold when they were filming it. And I'm really relating to that at the moment because it was absolutely, it's sort of bitter up in Scotland in the winter, which is where they're filming it. But it kind of represents this sort of beauty, which the horrifying bit plays against. Let me see if I can share my screen again, just so that we can get back onto my thing. We will share. Yeah, where is it? It's not letting me do it. That's so weird. Give me a second. Bear with me. Slideshow from current slide. There. Escape. This. File Explorer. There we go. This. Current slide. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So yeah, those sort of pseudo-pagan environments. The idyll that we show in those sort of folk horror settings, they kind of beckon hope. So they should be comforting and reassuring, but they're often not. So nature's used as this sort of symbol of beauty that should be preserved, and they're often untouched by modernity. So one of the characteristics of folk horror is that the modern life, you know, modern architecture, technology isn't often represented at all, because the modern influence is the outsider coming in. And that's where that modernity is the threat to that sort of idyll. So that's a real feature of folk horror. And it's also that the story's settings are tied up with preserving the health of the land. So a lot of these.
Nick, sorry, I think we're seeing the wrong screen. We're seeing a file explorer folder.
Okay.
Because you can share more than one screen. Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay. Right. Let's just get rid of all of my screens. Let's pop that up. Wow. How about this? I can't see what you see. I suppose that's the thing, isn't it?
I assume we're looking at slides, or we should be.
Yeah, we are. I'm gonna say.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you if we are.
You tell me. You stay unthing. Once you say where. Okay. So if I go that.
Yeah, we can see the slides now. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go back to this. So let's go to the slideshow. Yeah. So you can see that there. You've got this characteristics of folk horror. Have you? And you've got.
Yeah, we've got that.
Okay, it's all working. Great.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to recap, it's set in these pagan environments. They're idylls. They're hopeful. Nature is a symbol of beauty. Modernity is characterized by the outsider rather than anything in the environment, and the health of the land needs to be preserved. So it's about keeping nature or the pagans' gods happy. And a little bit, this was sort of in reference to the fact that you know, in those sort of you know, these farming communities, the health of the crops was a bit of a random thing, and if they failed, then it was disastrous for the whole community. So these rituals were sort of generated from them, and keeping hold of them was incredibly important for those who lived there. So if an outsider came in and disrupted it, then they would be, you know, got rid of, disposed, murdered, however it was. And that is rich territory for that sort of contemporary folk kind of horror. And it's there as a real contrast to the sort of scary castle trope. And I think it was a little bit that, you know, if you've got a spooky castle and there's lightning flashing and all that sort of stuff, you've covered the sort of spooky bit. So if you put Dracula into it, you're sort of saying the same thing twice. Whereas what these writers were interested in was the contrast between the beautiful surroundings and the sort of horrifying kind of subtext to it. So a really early example of this was The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, that was written in the 1940s. I think it was published in the New Yorker magazine, actually, and we'll go on to magazine publishing of these stories. But this is set in this small town, which every June, so a summer ritual, they randomly select a citizen to serve as like a communal scapegoat. And it's really chilling because it's so brutal and matter of fact. And the lotteries, I think it's names out of a hat. It's carried out, and then there's this act of communal savagery which it facilitates in order to keep the town safe for the year. So names out of a hat, and I think the person chosen is like stoned to death, which everybody watches. And the people in the town don't even know why they do this ritual, and that's the kind of chilling thing about it, you know. And there's also this huge resistance to any suggestion that they should stop doing it. You know, there's this like, there's always been a lottery. So I think at some point somebody says, why are we even doing this? It's awful. And it's like, well, it's the old ways, we always do it. And it's just that kind of random, unquestioning, kind of horrible reality of life that is just at the sort of, I think, the plot device at the heart of this sort of thing. And in a way, you know, the scapegoat in contemporary folk horror is a really important part of it, because it is so brutal and horrifying. I mean, it plays this really significant role in religion and literature anyway, in that they're there to sort of purge the sins of the community. You know, the whole community is guilty, really, but you just focus it on one person, and then you get rid of all your sins for that year or that month or whatever it is. There are various versions of it, like, you know, the Sin Eater, which is where kind of like the sins of the community are like baked into a feast, and the person has to eat it to get rid of it, and then, you know, often is poisoned or dies, or just, you know, or just standard Roman and Greek beatings of slaves, whichever it happens to be. So there's a real spectrum of how scapegoats are used, and a lot of them were kind of captured in this sort of anthropological book, The Golden Bough, which was by Fraser, which was sort of study of mythology and religion. It was quite a controversial book when it came out, because he also included Christianity in the list of kind of folklore traditions, and everyone thought it was a bit above that. But yeah, he listed some of these kind of sacrificial tropes, which contemporary folk horror writers have really made good use of. They're even used in, you know, contemporary literature. So the tributes in the Hunger Games are a good example of them, or Arthur Miller's the Crucible, which is, you know, sort of based on the Salem witch hunts, just shows sort of the power of these sort of brutal scapegoat rituals. It's particularly helpful in folk horror because it is so random. There is no real moral framework attached to them. So a scapegoat might be chosen who is a sort of much loved member of the community, or a child, as in the case of, you know, the lottery. And the randomness is also the terrifying bit of it. So no matter what you've done in your life, you may not be saved from the scapegoat, but often the scapegoat is the outsider that comes in as a kind of convenient way of purging that society. So I mentioned that the lottery was sort of New York, you know, it was published in New York. One of the really important sort of, you know, moment where these sorts of subgenres of fiction and kind of many others actually flourished was in the advent of magazine publishing. You know, so by bypassing a kind of traditional publishing model, which might not find an audience, was quite expensive. The magazines like Weird Tales, which I think is still going today, but it was sort of founded in the 1920s, and it was founded by a man called Henneberger, who was really inspired by sort of H.G. Wells stories, and he wanted a place where writers could explore sort of more you know, kind of niche genres or play with the form and stuff. And so in the 1920s was the early publisher of H.P. Lovecraft and various other sort of important horror writers. But it was really influential across a range of genres, including fantasy and sci-fi. And it still has a proud tradition of sort of championing those kind of new voices. But it did lead to a really important sort of outcrop of new contemporary folk horror writing. I think it reached its peak pretty much in the 70s. So I mean, I kicked off with The Wicker Man of 1973, partly as a moment where that folk horror tradition was sort of just seems to be absolutely everywhere. This Thomas Tyrant story, Harvest Home, is a good example of that. All of it was film influenced. In fact, Thomas Tyrant came up through the film industry. He was a real leading light of this sort of publishing boom, and that's partly because he understood some of the sort of iconic visual power of folk horror. It came out in 1973, and essentially it again uses some of these sort of traditional techniques where the novel, it contrasts this sort of this really beautiful agricultural setting with these arcane and appalling folk rituals. So the main character, Ned Constantine, is a sort of this go-getter from New York who he wants to simplify his life and move to New England. And actually that's one of the really common characteristics, like let's get away from the city and find a life that's more simple. And then it ends up just being brutal and awful, you know, and he finds that the residents in this New England village practice some of these terrible pagan beliefs of their ancestors, and in a way there's this kind of moral context to it, because the actual style of the writing is a bit like a sort of an address from the pulpit. It's a bit kind of fire and brimstone stuff. I managed to find a screen grab of it, which is where you get this. Let me see if I can see it. You know, the kind of how. So I think this is sort of the opening of it is like, how quickly does joy often succeed to sorrow, the day of cheerful hope to that of gloomy fear, and the season of plenty and the abundance to that of wants and scarcity. I mean, it's full of like exclamation marks and, you know, references to the sort of the hands of God and the, you know, and mercy and God's goodness, and let's be thankful for it and that sort of stuff. So it was clearly sort of making making this kind of moral compass for it in order to allow some of these sort of the brutal things that follow. So it's an interesting novel from the 70s, which is sort of exploring some of those horrible rituals within a context, and seen through the eyes of someone who's lived in a so-called civilized city. Got to mention Stephen King, probably. It was one of those perhaps traditionally associated with other sorts of, more straightforward sort of horror genres. He did dip his toe into folk horror. One of the ones that sort of picked out was his 1976 story, The Children of Corn. And again, we've got kind of a married couple who come from the outside, Bert and Vicky. That in their case, they're sort of sidetracked, so it's don't stray off the path, and you end up in these communities. They're driving through rural Nebraska, off the beaten track, find themselves in this place called Gatlin, where they discover a sort of bit of history about a terrifying outbreak of religious mania that took place 12 years before. And as they look into it, they discover that it's inspired by the ravings of a teenage prophet. The town's children murdered every adult in a single night in this town. I mean, it's like, yeah, let's just route one. And those kids are now sort of living alone under the eye of the corn of God, grown old and strange and hungry. So essentially they sort of like murdered their entire sort of the adult system, and then are kind of growing up weirdly in amongst these beautiful fields of corn. And, you know, in the traditional, it doesn't end well for the outsider. So poor old Bert and Vicky come to a sticky end. And actually, in the end, I think, you know, in despair, all the children kind of, sacrifice themselves to this corn at the end. And in a way, it's these fields of corn that are the kind of arbiters of the way this town kind of completely disintegrates. And we're left with these images of these beautiful, pristine fields of corn that kind of are totally untouched by kind of human interference and indifferent to our suffering, you know, and that's a horrifying thing about it. So as well as the rural themes in folk horror, we also get, as we've sort of talked about before, the kind of fish out of water is a very important part of it. We need to be able to see these crazy worlds through the eyes of an outsider. What's great about that is that they often appear really beautiful and charming and bucolic and wonderful initially, and then a kind of creeping dread, creeping oddness starts to come in. The rites and the rituals are absolutely brutal and incomprehensible. You can kind of really see no connection with anything that you might find in your sort of normal life, and they're unquestioned, and that makes them even more terrifying. Often these places are sort of weirdly isolated. There's a real sense in, and this is about, you know, if you're writing this kind of contemporary folk horror, is that they're strangely isolated and cut off communities, untouched by the kind of wider world outside. And also any mechanisms for contacting anybody feel really limited. I mean, in kind of really contemporary versions of it, like some of the sort of Swedish Midsummer type sort of films, you know, there are mechanisms by which contacts in the outside world are prevented, or you have to put those barriers up. But in this, you know, in the sort of 20th century versions of it, it was much easier to isolate these communities. There's also sometimes an element of buried history that the characters will find or uncover, or it's something that those communities are keeping secret. And sometimes it's just about a memory of a thing rather than history. So it might even be something that exists either in the protagonist's own head or in the heads of the community. We'll just have a look at, I think the fish out of water and the rites and rituals, I think we've sort of covered with some of the other examples. We'll just have a look at how modern authors are dealing with some of these other themes. So I just wanted to kind of flag up an example called The Reddening. And this is a novel set in this is a novel set in a bit of beautiful coastline, and it centers on this journalist called Katrine, who is attempting to escape some past traumas by moving to a seaside coast, a rural idyll where the outsiders are unwelcome. It's largely believed to be Devon, actually, which is where the author lives. And along the way, during an archaeological dig, a burial site's discovered where they understand that early humans have been butchering each other across 60,000 years. So it's really ancient past stuff, revealing really horrible and brutal rituals. But the main character, partly from where she comes from, is really predetermined to dig deeply into it, and it's partly because they choose a character who won't let it go. So there are unresolved issues in the main character, which means that she starts pulling at a string that she shouldn't be pulling at, you know, and that's the kind of key to this sort of thing. Essentially, if you went on a holiday to Devon and you discovered a brutal burial site with sort of where people have been killing each other for 60,000, you might just leave. But, you know, because of the flaws or the unresolved issues in the characters, of course they start going into it, because, you know, that's a little thing that's gnawing at them anyway. And because they get in too deep, actually, they start getting, you know, the plot means that they start becoming inadvertently part of these old rituals. It's one of these folk horrors that you could also describe as survival horror. So essentially, a lot of the book is just about having uncovered these rituals, trying to survive them later. He's called Adam Neville, the writer, and I brought him up partly because he's in Birmingham, and he's sort of like local. He's really good, but he's also he just seems like a really nice author. He just like gives these books out to people. So if he's one of these, he's probably terrible. I don't know if he's earning any money, but you know, if you ask him for a book, he'll just give you one. So it's sort of anyway, so yeah, that's an example of this kind of this buried past, but also a buried past that is where the main character is a bit susceptible to that. Other themes: isolation. I picked out Elmet Fiona Mosley, who wrote this novel in 2017. Really young writer, did really well. So this was a novel that's clearly just inspired by a kind of bit of Ted Hughes poem, where he writes about the remains of Elmet. Ted Hughes described Elmet as the last independent Celtic kingdom in England, and originally stretched out over the Vale of York. But even into the 17th century, this narrow cleft and its side gunnels under the glaciated moors was still a badlands, a sanctuary for refugees from the law. So clearly the author has sort of thought, oh, well, that's a good place to set something, like an ancient badlands, maybe there's stuff in the soil that I can kind of get inspired by. And it's about the horror stories finding their locations, landscapes with a violent past that can resurface, the unearthing of forgotten barbarities, injustices, all that kind of stuff. We haven't got time to sort of read aloud, but she's got this really interesting start where I just want you to alert you to the form of it. It starts off with this thing: I cast no shadow, smoke rests behind me and daylight is stifled. I count sleepers and the numbers rush. I count rivets and bolts. I walk north. My first 2 steps are slow, languid. I am unsure of direction, but in that initial choice I am pinned. I have passed through the turnstile and the gate is locked. Just really enjoyed that kind of first person, present, just to sort of we're just in the moment straight away. It reverts to different narrative, styles throughout, but that initial kind of almost filmic way of writing those opening moments to kind of hook a reader in is really sort of vibrant way of starting works like this, where you can almost hear the narrator's breath as they sort of breathe and the tension rises, which I really admired about this. She finishes that bit with so she sets the scene really sort of immediately. The next morning I continue on my way. The remains of Elmet lie beneath my feet, and then we're sort of in. And she's that was her first novel as well, which I think was great. That's what I love about this kind of fiction, is that someone has this kind of these sort of really vibrant ideas, writes them down with a sense of massive urgency, gets the craft right, and and it's your first piece of work. And I think this was probably hers straight out of college or something, which is great. Another one just to sort of point up is the Gallows Pole by Benjamin Myers. This sort of kind of interested in this folk horror, but also kind of historical fiction. And for some reason, because he goes back in the past, it can be even more violent and chilling. But this is set in the world of coin forgers of the 18th century. Again, a bit like the previous example, you just find a tiny little scrap of history. And, he's obviously sort of found this thing where people were forging coins, in this sort of 1700s, and thought, well, that's a great context for something, and it means it's a really sort of particular kind of environment. But he also has created this world where the seclusion of the characters in it is the aesthetic, and because it's secluded, violence is far more possible. So, I mean, that's just another common trope, that the more isolated, the less connected you are, the more it's possible, the possibilities for sort of really brutal violence is possible for the characters and the plot, and therefore, really rich territory for horror. And he also in that started kind of creating a new syntax to sort of illustrate this world. So it can, depending on your choice, depending on your sort of taste, I suppose, he started sort of inventing a bit of a, he's got a kind of new grammar and vocab and spell it, he's created this sort of new weird hybrid language, even though you can understand it as you read it, been as it is the first and last confession of David Hartley at the time of his capture and imprisonment. Strangely, you know, if you read it out, it's one of these weird ones where if you read it out loud, it makes total sense. But if you look at it on the page, it's just this really unsettling kind of, you know, sort of disorientating effect. And you kind of get used to it and you get into the groove of it, but at the same time, it feels like it's of the world, but not of the world. We'll come back to this a little bit in this idea of uncanny, but they are familiar words made a little bit unfamiliar, which sort of really helps with that. Yeah, it helps with that feeling of being unsettled, not knowing quite where you are in the story and how to read it, which I think is sort of an interesting feature of some of these sort of folk horror writers. Yeah, that's so I don't know why he's got this sort of classic kind of penguin classics cover, but he also writes folk crime, which is another little sort of, you know, genre mashup sort of thing. What I love about Benjamin Myers is that, you know, he's like failed A-level English. He was rejected from 100 universities. You know, it was like he's just like just not look like a writer who's going to be really successful. But and consequently, he's very much in about sort of don't let anyone get in your way. We're talking about writing now rather than the craft, if you like. But I think Phil, it always struck me. He was a founding member of the Brutalist, which is this like literary collective. It is seen to be one of the early movements sort of launched by, you know, social networking sites kind of things. But they had this manifesto, which is like, brutalism calls for writing that touches upon levels of raw honesty that is lacking from most mainstream fiction. I mean, clearly he's angry. We cannot simply sit around waiting to be discovered. We'd rather do it ourselves. Total control, total creativity. The Brutalists see ourselves as a band who have put down their instruments, picked up their pens and scalpels instead. The only maxim we adhere to is an old punk belief, which we have bastardized for our own means. Here's a laptop, here's a spell check, now write a book kind of thing. So he's really into this thing, which is like, if you want to do it, and, you know, sort of sod the system kind of thing. I think he slightly let himself down with the spell check bit, but anyway, you know, it's sort of, especially in the book that he then wrote, which, but yeah, I think this again, I suppose, capturing the spirit of those sort of magazine stories and weird stories. On the whole, these sorts of genres do encourage a kind of a sort of outlier writers who you know, aren't into the sort of traditional systems of literary fiction, if you like, which makes them really interesting, you know. And some of the, I mean, a lot of it is awful, but, you know, there is a kind of, you know, it's like the Wild West a bit, which is kind of exciting. So yeah, one of the other themes is the buried histories. We've come into it as well, but there are various different ways of treating that. Experimental film is a story by Gemma Files, and that's from 2015. And in this case, the narrator is this film historian who starts to investigate the disappearance of this filmmaker, this sort of weird filmmaker who made these sort of odd, peculiar films, sort of based on a folk legend of an unforgiving lady midsummer, and Gemma writes it a little bit like in acts, so she borrows from screenplay sort of structures, so the sort of form echoing the content, which is really interesting. But she's got this idea, it's a really interesting central idea, that every movie is a ghost story. And what she means by that is just that, you know, at some point, as you watch films, everybody involved in it will be dead. And so what you're watching in older films as they kind of come on is increasingly a sort of like a spectral document of people who no longer exist anymore, you know, and their work is there. And she was sort of like riffing off that in order to make this film, which I think is just like really, really great that you can kind of have these sort of unusual takes, you know, on what constitutes a horror story and what constitutes a buried history that doesn't necessarily have to be all about kind of pagan rituals, but they could be pagan rituals as captured in a film score, you know, in a film script or something, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, another quick one to mention is The Lonely by Andrew Hurley. So this is a bit about memory, really. So the idea that buried histories are about what's in your brain. So this is about this middle-aged man who just remembers his childhood holidays from the 70s. I mean, it's a kind of curious thing. I think the really fascinating idea that you might sort of think back on your summer holidays and kind of think, was there something weird about that? I don't know, maybe there was. And maybe that's a horror story, you know, and you don't know it at the time, but then you have to go back because something's not right. And this particular one, he sets it in the Lancashire coastline. And when he goes back, the body of a child is discovered, and this unlocks a whole series of, actually, maybe this was a really screwed up set of summer holidays I went on, or Easter holidays that I went on. I mean, in this case, he's like, from where he comes from, he's exploring sort of like tension between Catholicism and pagan belief, and, you know, linking that to the landscape sort of thing. But essentially, it's more importantly about these sort of slightly bothersome memories that he has that he wants to unpack. He's got this nice thing, which I think is a good thing about those stories, where you set out your stall by putting quotes at the top of your novel. So clearly, when you open his book, he's got a quote from Matthew there, from the Bible, and from W.B. Yeats, The Second Coming. You know, one's So and so you sort of feel like you know where you are when someone sort of does the quote bit at the top. You know, so I like it. It feels like a really helpful bit of a sort of navigation tool for you. Yeah, The Lonely, and Andrew Michael Hurley. Well, the great thing about this, again, we're talking about outliers in fiction. You know, they only printed 278 copies of this book, and then, you know, it got, as they put it forward for a prize, it got so it won the debut novel and all that sort of stuff, and then it was off and running. But it was just seen as a really good example of, you know, contemporary British Gothic, and you know, I like those kind of stories, you know. So yeah, in terms of the folk horror, in summary, we got the subversion of the rural idyll. It betrays the beautiful. It deploys strangers and outsiders who are totally ignorant of the rules. We've got its seclusion and isolation to remove any support structures, and you can also explore the inner horror to some extent. You explore the horror because you've got it in you yourself, in the characters. And there are narratives about hidden or buried histories, even ones in our own heads. So a lot of these carry over a little bit into eco-horror, but there are some subtle differences in a way. So with eco, we haven't got time to see this really, but I thought we'd just sort of like, this is like basically Mad Max. I was going to introduce this thing, but essentially Mad Max, which we all know. But I'll just summarize what happens there. But it's, you know, just like petrol is a commodity, and essentially it is kind of, you know, this big metaphor for sort of the running out of these sort of various crucial kind of you know, fuels that we all need. And eco horror is really interested in that kind of end game, and so they're based on.
Sorry, Nick, it's okay from our point of view. I think if you want to go over a few minutes, there's no problem from our side. Oh, okay. Obviously, it's up to you if you've got time. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll hit it. That was it's the 1980s Mad Max. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's fairly cringy to look at, but it's sort of I mean, the kind of point is made is that, like, those sort of the eco horror sort of genre based on these environmental themes and plot lines also are kind of sort of correspondingly social concerns as well. So a little bit shifting from the folk horror thing is that the sort of eco horror genre are responding to, you know, real fears in a way. They're just sort of capturing a real fear and trying to sort of do something interesting with those. I mean, Mad Max there, I mean, that's not, you know, in a way, in the 80s, it felt like a kind of random thing, the idea that we'd all be fighting over petrol, but, you know, it just feels weirdly real kind of now. And yeah, despite the kind of gore and the terror that you sort of have to have a little bit, or that you know that often accompanies, you know, horror fiction, it does have a message or a conscience quite a lot of the time. quite a lot of the time, and touches some of the sort of fears that feel like kind of really contemporary ones. Sort of. Yeah, so climate fiction has been around for a while. It's not always horror or the biopunk thing. So it's a bit of a niche version of that. So using some of the horror tropes, some of the horror conventions, but in this climate fiction sort of world. It's really sort of interesting and rich. And as we'll see, there are really a ton of examples about it. So some of the things that they look at in this genre, the consequences of environmental contamination, overpopulation sometimes comes into that, other civilization of others, so like plagues, infestations, and generally Earth, as I put it here, Earth-threatening perils in a nightmarish context. So yeah, I mean brace yourself before you read these things in a way, just because it's near to home, but they're apocalyptic really, but often based on sort of fairly sound science and a kind of, to some extent, a kind of we're not far off type. It plays off that idea, even if you don't believe it. It's got a kind of proud heritage, clearly. I mean, there are many examples that we could kind of bring up, but the one I picked up was The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard, which I think is the 60s, is it? Yeah, 1962, where he describes a kind of a dystopian future. It's set in London in 2145, which is basically like 20 years. It's 20 years from now, sort of thing. In London, that is now a boiling lagoon. So and it's both a cautionary tale or a metaphor. I mean, he was, you take your pick with Ballard, really. But what I like about it, aside from it being a kind of interesting novel in itself, he's got this habit. He sometimes carries it on. I don't know if they're in all of them, where the chapter headings, he gives really beautiful chapter headings to each of his chapters. On the Beach at the Ritz, The Coming of the Iguanas, all that sort of stuff, Descent into Deep Time. And there's this odd effect of kind of turning every chapter into a little mini short story, which I find a really satisfying kind of device, and it kind of honors each chapter in that way by giving them a title. I think it's really great. I mean, yeah, they have that in TV show. I always like a good title in a TV show, just seems to sort of make the whole thing, I don't know, just like really whole and pure. And Ballard does that. And it was one of these ones that it hadn't occurred to me before that maybe you can make your novel better by giving each chapter a really great title. And so and if people ask, is this a novel or is it a series of short stories, and you don't have to answer. So yeah, an important moment in this eco horror was a anthology of in 1994 called The Earth Strikes Back, which was ecological horror fiction, and it was all the task of that anthology was to look at this sort of dystopian present that we were either about to enter or that we were currently in. It was edited by this guy Richard Chismar, and essentially it was trying to capture what turned out to be quite a fast moving situation in the ecological state of the world. So certainly one of the characteristics of that one was that there were references to the hole in the ozone layer, which was something that was a big thing at the time, but is actually been superseded by other big things, and it's those sort of touchstone moments, which is where we were talking about ozone layers in the 90s, but it's sort of climate emergency, climate change, sort of now. But it was attempting to sort of riff off some of those things. And this, in many ways, this genre includes more broadly the Mother Nature is pissed off novel kind of sort of genre, and that's where it's not just about the weather, essentially. So so a few examples where different kind of eco horror sort of genres are included, really. Things like In the Dust of This Planet, which is Eugene Thacker, which is like we've got hundreds of eco stories in this one work. I mean, sort of everything happens in that one. Milton's Children by Jason Brock is like about absolutely cataclysmic global warming. Feels like that's the root one. You know, we'd expect something like that. White Fire by Brian Keane is about supervisors. Honestly, when I first sort of looked into this, like, oh well, you know, whatever. But we, you know, kind of currently, I mean, this is the thing you see about this kind of fiction, is that, you know, you read it and it's like this, they imagine the worst, and then you suddenly find yourself sort of living through something a little bit related. But yeah, White Fire about a super virus. This is kind of funny one, the vegan revolution with zombies. So this is about, yeah, this is David Agranoff, about sort of, you know, novel about, you know, about people turning into zombies if they eat meat. And he's an interesting guy. I'm not a massive fan of the actual stuff itself, but what I like about it is that he'll write the novel and then he'll get his mates together and he'll do a trailer. He'll make like a film trailer about his book. And I think that's just like, it's such a cool thing to do. You know, I mean, he seems to be having a lot of fun with it. But essentially, yeah, another little slant on that eco thing. And then perhaps, you know, something like, you know, a bit Mad Maxy, this work called Petro Plague by Amy Rogers, and yeah, same sort of territory. In this one, we've got, she speculates about a particular sort of bacteria that eats fuel. So it's not that we're using fossil fuels up. There's an accelerated effect where these bugs are eating all the fuel. So we're really quickly running out. She's got this sort of interesting thing. I sort of picked it up just because, you know, the opening, she's called it Anarchy on the Streets of Los Angeles. The opening, in a flash, Christina wondered if they just wanted her bike. Should she drop it and run? But on foot, she would be completely powerless. The gap between her and her pursuers was down to 3 or 4 seconds and closing. A sob slipped from her lips. There was no escape, unless no time to analyze the risk. 2 hours ahead, she's like, anyway, blah, blah, blah. It goes on a bit like that. I kind of sort of wanted to pick it out because it's not great writing, really. I mean, in many ways, it's sort of weirdly naive, and you know, it needs to be a little bit elevated, but there's something there's something sort of urgent about it. You know, she's being a little bit writerly with this. A sob slipped from her lips, you know. You know, so you can tell that, so you can see the writing a little bit, which takes you out of the moment. But it's interesting how sort of precarious these kind of scene-setting moments are. That if you're in the moment, you don't want the writing to take you away from the moment. You know, you just want to be in there, not distracted by, oh yeah, she's gotten to the thesaurus and tried to find something better, you know, and all that sort of stuff. And it's odd how the writerliness of something can kind of get in the way of it being good writing. And so, you know, it feels like, you know, I think I haven't, it's a while since I've read that one, so it's sort of like being unfair to it. And in a way, you kind of get carried away with the story, so fine. But it's just one of these ones that that if in this particular genre you're trying to sort of put somebody in the moment, it's quite easy to sort of distract them away from it by a bit of something that just sort of feels a little bit wrong and not quite, you know. I think have the kind of confidence in the in the sort of urgent description of it, because the moment's quite urgent. Anyway, I throw that in just because that's another good example of that particular genre. And yeah, again, few sort of anthologies dealing with this. The Mother's Revenge from the Scary Press was doing it as well. This is a bit more recent, so this is from sort of 2017, just a few years ago. You know, a dark and bizarre anthology of global proportions, they called it, and there were 32 short stories in that one. And it just covers everything, you know, animal uprisings, planetary catastrophe, cosmic nightmares, you know, just you name it. So yeah, so in, you know, kind of in summary about the eco horror bit, we've got this idea that just sort of distinct from the folk thing, this idea that the earth is essentially like a sort of can be this sort of vengeful, almost Old Testament God. So if you do wrong by it, you will be sort of enormously punished. It kind of illustrates the suicidal tendencies of the human race. So, you know, it's a sort of absolute blatant kind of running down of our, you know, the place where we live, you know, in this sort of like weirdly nihilistic, you know, why would we just cut the branch off that we're sitting on kind of world. It's a really good genre for leveling the playing fields, you know. I mean, it's literal leveling of the playing fields often, in order to reverse these sort of normal hierarchies. So you get a lot of unlikely heroes in this genre. I think that, you know, there's a really good kind of archetypal sort of, you know, tropes of fiction, you know, heroes of fiction, all those archetypes that are brought to a range of different fictions. But if there's one that sort of a little bit dominates, you know, the sort of the eco horror bit, it's these people who have perhaps been marginalized before and all their worst fears are realized, but they're the only ones equipped to deal with it. So it's, you know, it's really good for that kind of thing. It's really close to the bone. Obviously, you can't read this without thinking, I wonder how far we are off this. And there's this weirdly interesting end justifying the means. Petroplague particularly is one of these ones where, like, the strategies that the difference between eco-activism and eco-terrorism, you know what I mean, means it's like it's a really blurry moral thing where sometimes the heroes feel like they might be violating their own ideals. Do you know what I mean? So, you know, and sometimes that moral hazard's quite an interesting feature of it as well. So what we've got with both, we share a kind of new sort of the uncanny, which is the normal gone wrong, basically. We'll just briefly go over this, but there's also this sort of there are eerie and weird qualities about it. And we've got this hauntology idea, which we'll just sort of briefly say, if I'm all right to go on for a couple more minutes. So this new uncanny thing, just sort of the old uncanny is basically like the Freud essay about unheimlich, okay, which I'm sure you've all gone through. So it's often read as unhomely. And this is just this like contrast between the known and the familiar and the unknown and the unfamiliar, okay, and this feeling of wrongness, which is an absolute trope of horror. So that particular paper was all based around this story by the German writer Hoffmann called The Sandman, and this was a short story which was about this child who thought back about the terror of this Sandman, who was said to steal the eyes of children who would not go to bed, and he'd feed those eyes to his own children who lived on the moon, okay, and you know, and the character falls under the spell of this beautiful doll whose eyes have been put in place by a terrifying figure who he mistakes for the Sandman himself. And you know, it's a complex story, but essentially the upshot of it is that sleep then becomes death, okay, and that so something really familiar and normal like sleep, dolls, toys, whatever, are made really unfamiliar and unnerving. You know, like sleep is death. Toys are haunted, you know, all that sort of stuff. So you're familiar, and it links back to the folk horror stuff, which is about beautiful nature is actually really terrifying and scary underneath, and that's the uncanny. That's the uncanny effect. This inspired a whole bunch of new writing. So there was this anthology called The New Uncanny, where sort of modern writers were asked to respond to this idea and make some new stories up about the uncanny, produce their own uncanny stories. And there's you know, there's 16 odd of them there, I think, something like that. Frank Cottrell Boyce does one. He's got this really nice one about, you know, where the horror of being forced to live in a computer simulation like The Sims. In fact, it might actually be The Sims, but essentially it's this moral tale about parental neglect. But it's sort of, you know, it's not really good. And there's Adam Morek's got this sad fell. He sort of speculates about autism being contagious, sort of like, and what that would do. So again, a kind of moral thing, just like think about it differently. Hanif Qureshi's got one about a man meets his dead father. A lot of that is just in this deadpan, you know, really normal exchange with the dead person. A.S. Byatt comes in. She just goes in at, straightforward with a creepy doll story. She just goes there. And then there's this really weird one called Nicholas Royal, called The Dummy. And it's a really interesting thing. I haven't got to the bottom of this, but Nicholas Royal there's a Nicholas Royal who's an academic who writes about the uncanny. In fact, I think he's written one of the standard works about the uncanny. I can't remember which university he teaches at. And then there's Nicholas Royal, who's a different person, I believe, who is a novelist, who writes about the uncanny as a novelist. And he wrote this thing called The Dummy, which is about a doppelganger. And he's got this really weird play where it's like, hey, are they the same person? Are they different people? It's like, I don't know if he's playing a game with his life or whether it's just a weird coincidence that he's taken advantage of. Anyway, we've got sort of like the uncanny is sort of encapsulated by things like, it's the creepy toys thing. So often in this kind of contemporary horror world, both eco and folk, and sort of more broadly, toys or contemporary items that are supposed to be they act as these vessels that are so powerful. The subject themselves, are kind of drained of their initial kind of, purpose or whatever, and they become something that they're not. So toys are often used because they're supposed to be there as a source of comfort, and when they're used as a source of, Chucky or whatever, it's that world basically. And because they stand in for the innocent, the harmless, the object of joy and happiness and comfort, and the folk does it, with the innocence of the rural. I think this has been reframed in various different ways. So we've got the weird and the eerie. So Mark Fisher was one of the ones who talked about this at the University of Warwick. He talked about the weird being something that doesn't belong. It shouldn't or couldn't exist, and yet there it is. So, it's one of these things where sort of a really incongruous object or item is suddenly placed in a really familiar sort of surrounding. So, and then the contrast to that is when something's absent. So we find the eerie more readily in landscapes partially emptied by the human. So, for example, in eerie, it's if you go into a shopping centre at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday and it's totally empty, and it's like, okay, it's eerie because there's an absence of people. So the weird, it's like the absence of something odd that shouldn't be there. Like, you go down into your sort of kitchen, and in the middle of the floor, there's like sort of a hand, or something, or even not even that weird. It could just be incongruous. Whatever, you take your pick. And then the eeriness is the idea of something that's sort of like missing. And this is a little bit about this sort of idea of now we've got to a point in contemporary fiction where everything is haunted by everything, not only ghosts or whatever horror tropes. It's a Derrida term, which is this idea that society now is just haunted by everything, including cultural artifacts, previous works of fiction, figures portrayed in film, modern cultural output. Everything just haunts everything that we do. There's an echo of something just because there's been so much of it, and that in itself is horrifying. So it's a really, really interesting bit of contemporary horror is that we are haunted by our own culture. We pine for it, we mourn it. It might not have existed, not really. It's an artifact, but it's kind of there anyway. So dystopic future, eco future, it's sort of haunted by kind of ideas of previous haunted fiction, or rural or folk horror is haunted by ideas of, like kind of landscapes that we don't see anymore. So we've got all that stuff, hauntology. I'm just skimming through it a bit just because, it's kind of interesting, but it's not. There we go. Folk horror, subversion of the idyll. Common dystopias in eco-horror, Mother Nature punishing us, unlikely heroes, uncanny, weird, eerie strategies that are deployed in all those things, and that we're haunted in both horror ghost ways, but also culturally haunted. All of them will share like tension and fear strategies, you know, which is either tension through plot or through the structure in which they decide to do the plot. Interesting, just to sort of name check Laszlo Egri, The Art of Dramatic Writing. He identified 3 sorts of tension: the sort of static, the jumping, or the slowly rising tension. And essentially, this is just a way of you can either use in this writing a sort of static tension which sits in the moment, but nothing really moves on. It's like an argument that goes nowhere, but you just sit in the same state of tension, which some writers do really successfully all the way through. You can have a kind of jumping tension where you get this out of the blue escalation of tension. So nothing has happened, and then there's suddenly a big blow up. Which can arguably break the tension, not keep it. And then the ideal thing was just this slowly rising tension, which is tension that creates more story, which creates more tension, which creates more story, and so on. And so the best examples of the ones I've sort of given are those that are sort of deploy this slowly rising tension. You just keep turning the screw all the way through. And there are various structures that support that. You know, 5-act, 4-act structures often are a way of kind of keeping the tension going. And then at heart, finally, the whole thing is just based on fear generally. And essentially, as writers, they've just identified what it is that they want to sort of talk about. You know, there's the fear itself thing, which is often, you know, it's just your own inner demons. And then there's all the sort of like genuinely horrific things. So, you know, you could delve into the sort of psychology of it as much as you want, but just sort of briefly, there are sort of five basic fears. We've got the extinction fear, the mutilation fear, the ego death, the sort of esteem fear, the separation fear, and the loss of autonomy. So just to quickly go through those in no particular order. The extinction one, which is a lot of the eco one, it's not just a fear of death, but it's sort of a sudden, unexpected annihilation, essentially a sort of primary annihilation of everything and everything you believe in, a sudden stop. So there's that fear as a category. There's the mutilation fear, and I don't know if it's still on Moodle, Tim, but this was like a horrible read when I looked at it, when you put it up there. But, you know, Damien's the regicide on Moodle for just a description of the most horrendous. Yeah, some people have read it clearly. But there's the mutilation fear. There's the ego death fear, and that's essentially the fear of, it's the shame and humiliation. Yeah. Which actually weirdly has got a weird revival at the moment. It's very easy to have a kind of absolutely abject and terrifying and total humiliation in a way that we've invented ways of humiliating people that we didn't have even 20 years ago now. So actually, in many ways, it's sort of a rich source of horror fiction, the ego death fear, just because it's just so possible now, the kind of the cancel and that stuff. And separation, just fear of abandonment, so just being alone. And then the loss of autonomy, which is like the restricted thing, the paralyzed bit, claustrophobia bit, the buried in a grave, sort of waking up in a grave underground kind of fear, that sort of thing. And all of those at some level, those horror fictions, either folk horror or eco horror, will touch on something that's a bit linked to one of those, or even preferably a little combination of all of them. And so essentially, when you're coming to write your horror or eco fiction, you just have a little think about that bit. What are you afraid of? Delve into that, see which gives you the sweats, and make a little start, and then let the genre sort of drive from that. So there we are. Sorry, Tim, I ran over, but that's me done. That is the end of the lecture. Finally, 13 minutes past. Thank you for your attention.
Right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nick. A little clap from the audience.
Thanks for listening.
You might not hear it. Yeah. Well, that was fabulous, Nick. I'm found it fascinating. Do we have any questions from our audience? Questions? We must have a question, do we? There was a lot there, obviously, and Nick covered a lot. in a short time. I mean, I would have liked you to talk for weeks and weeks, you know, an hour every week about the different elements, which unfortunately we can't do, but that would have been great. And particularly about the, you know, the genres, how they're played out, you know, in different areas, like in cinema and then in fiction and so on. I mean, I thought it was interesting when you were talking about scapegoats. I mean, isn't Jesus himself your archetypal scapegoat? I mean, in the sense of,
yeah, I mean, I think this was the controversy of the book at the time. You know, it was all lumped together into that, and the idea that maybe, you know, that kind of narrative, which had become sort of a, you know, obviously a belief beloved of many, was being put in the same box as as just like those kind of Roman, you know, kind of festivals where someone was dressed up in a, you know, bunch of leaves, thrashed and kicked out of the, you know, kicked off a cliff, you know, and I think that's a sort of, but essentially, yeah, the scapegoaty bit. I mean, that's, I think, why a lot of those fictions do have those, yeah, sometimes those biblical resonances, because essentially they're scapegoat stories, you know.
and I mean, it goes back to the Greeks, doesn't it? Because I mean, like the Greek tragedy, the tragos was the word for goat, and so there had to be this sort of sacrifice, this scapegoat that took on, you know, that somehow, you know, led to some, you know, change or catharsis, you know, that changed, you know, the world and society as a result of something being sacrificed. Yeah, so I'm just looking to see who might be a good scapegoat amongst our students there. Any questions then for Nick while he's here? Yeah, Alex.
I just had more of a thought. You know, when you were talking about like the good tensions and the bad tensions, I did acting degree, and we spent like quite a lot of time on sort of the states of tension. So when you'd said about, do you know, the jumping one, is that when they do the you know, when they sort of go, and now there's a bomb? Is it kind of like that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's sort of, because it has a place. It has a place, but if it's unearned, then it feels like it's that it's random and cheap. And I suppose there's a difference between like a jumping tension and just a shock, because I think you can have a shock in there that feels fine, but it's more that if in the world, I think maybe it's a bit more, or particularly more relevant in, you know, thrillers, that essentially you just need to ramp it up a notch each time. And I think if that notch is too unbelievable or big, then you start to feel like you haven't increased the tension, you've sort of broken it.
Like too much of a release then. Yeah,
it's, or at least it's you know, it's you know, building a house of cards, you know, with, you know, and that, you know, it just, the whole thing is about that delicate one thing, then another thing, then another thing, and that's what builds the tension. Whereas if there's a sudden explosion of something, it can break it rather than escalate it.
But don't you think, Nick, or maybe this is for everybody, but it's like being, if you ever visit a couple, you know, a married couple or a partners who there's clearly something wrong in their relationship, and there's a kind of silent acceptance because there's a third person there that's deeply repressive, but at any moment there can be just something that comes out that shows the absolute horror and hatred between this couple that are together. And sometimes that is a really incredible sort of feel if you can communicate that in writing, and that's like an explosion that then is repressed again, you know, they put the lid back on, but you know, that makes it even worse, doesn't it? And is that the kind of thing that's going on in that, Nick, there?
Yeah, for sure. And I think in certainly in TV fiction, you know, you can kind of reset it. You know, it's I think you've got to be careful in film where it's like where you're there in one continuous narrative moment. but certainly in TV, the 4-act structure was built in order to be able to explode a moment and then go to a kind of commercial break and then come back again, and you've sort of reset it, so that you don't have to live through the aftermath and the recovery of it and the slow build of it. You can have maybe a little explosion and then go away and come back, and you know, and we've got through the resetting bit, and we're about building again. But that's just about choosing the way you deploy tension depending on what form you're writing in, because you know, you might have that in chapter breaks, you know, that you build to like little mini climaxes or hooks in chapter breaks, and then assume that the reader's going to do a little rest, or just, you know, can't resist and wants to get back, or that you move away to something else. You move your way to your B plot or your C plot, you know, so that it is possible to have mini escalations or those tensioned climaxes throughout your work, as long as you can navigate your way through it and you just don't totally blow it all in. You leave yourself nowhere to go if you sort of deploy too early.
I think that tension as well can add, can't it, to the horror of it? Because I remember watching a film, I think it was called Buried by Ryan Reynolds, and I've never been scared of being buried alive before. It never had come into my mind, but because that was so tense all the way through, and then what happened at the end, it scarred me for weeks. Like, it kept me awake, but I don't think it would have had that effect had they not built it so much up to that moment.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the prospect of it is the, you know, is the thing that creates the anxiety, you know, because you're in a state where you're being braced for the thing you fear most, and as soon as it doesn't, you know, as long as it doesn't happen, the more you're kept in a state of sometimes almost intolerable tension. And so, yeah, I mean, there are various different schools of thought of this, but one really good strategy is if you can hold off for as long as possible on seeing the monster, if you like, or realizing the actual thing. Unless you've got something up your sleeve, you know, you leave it for as long as you can, because that's where the tension sort of lies. It's a difficult one to pull off, and also just in text, you know, the good thing, you know, the interesting thing that can be supported in, you know, visual, you know, films and TV is that, you know, there's a whole, you know, for example, you know, Christopher Nolan, you know, I think gets a lot of his tension from you know, the contribution of, you know, the Hans Zimmer soundtrack, you know, sort of like who has this sort of weird thing running behind quite a lot, which is this Shepherd's Tone soundtrack feature, which is where everything appears to be rising. It's one of these things where you have a rising chord that goes up and up and up and up, but as it reaches the top, it sort of it fades away and is replaced by another one. So you've got these kind of waves of rising which never resolve. So it's almost as if you're in a kind of tense upwards point which never finishes, and you're left in this massive state of anxiety throughout the whole thing. I was wondering why, watching Dunkirk or whatever it was, I was just in a near state of constant tension, and it's because partly because the soundtrack is never resolving this sort of like this sort of tension spiral upwards. You know, it's always degrading it and then starting it again. And I think fiction needs to do something a little bit like that, you know, or always have something rising, even when you're slightly resolving one thing, you know. So in fiction or horror or thrillers, if you've got your ABCD stories, you know, just sort of like have your graph whereas one's reaching a tension. If you're gonna deploy it for a chapter break or an ad break or a hook or whatever it is, you've got another bit of rising tension going on in your B story, and then before you deploy that, then you've got your C, and then the whole thing culminates in some massive whatever it is at the end. Yeah, so there's quite a lot of technical craft about all that stuff, but there is a very technical genre, horror and you know, thriller and crime as well, which you're going on to talk about. You know, it's very, very technical. Whereas literary fiction can just break any old rule, can't it? Do what you like.
Any last questions? Because we're probably going to have to leave it there because we've gone quite a bit over time. And is there any last question from anybody? What do people think about? You mentioned humiliation as one of the main fears. I just wonder, in our world of sort of reality TV, do people care about humiliation? I mean, are you thinking there, Nick, of like social media and revenge porn and all this sort of stuff, or whatever it may be?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. The opportunities to sort of globally humiliate feel like greater. I mean, it always was a sort of, you know, even back to the kind of Victorian, the sort of the public shame thing felt like, you know, there had to be a mechanism around it. So you had to be prominent enough to be shamed, or it was in your society. I mean, it always existed. But I think, you know, it's that sort of John Ronson idea, you know, sort of like one misguided tweet or something, and your life is over. And actually that potentially is like, so how it's been seen as sort of commentators is like a little version of the random you know, you might get randomly killed on the street by a psychopath, which feels like a sort of like, that might be a random thing that happens to you. But also, you know, it's what it's talked about, that if you just sort of say slightly the wrong thing, and then it weirdly gets taken up, and then there's a takedown of your entire, you know, that is also weirdly like a kind of like the monster that will get you in the middle of the night sort of thing. And that is a possibility. And because there've been so many documented cases of it, you know, and as I mentioned John Ronson, who's just got a whole book, didn't he, about sort of So I've Been Publicly Shamed. and he's got these case studies of people who really, you know, they were just sort of regular people who sort of said and then created this kind of you know, horrifying sort of storm on their heads about it. Seen as a sort of a little bit of contemporary horror.
So are you going to ask something, Alex?
Yeah, I know that Eden's seen it. There's a thing, the Cecil Hotel. There was a guy who was publicly humiliated because they said that he basically murdered this woman. And just from things that people had said to him, he then like tried to commit suicide because he knew he was innocent. So stuff like that is quite horrifying as well, to be accused of something. And Caroline Flack as well. I just think that's like a public humiliation, because she was publicly humiliated until she didn't think she could go on anymore.
Yeah,
There was
exactly.
a Black Mirror story, wasn't there? Is it Black Mirror? What's it called? Was it Black Mirror? Was there a series? Am I getting the title mixed up?
Yeah, Black Mirror. Yeah, definitely.
Where some kid was, again, I think that was some sex thing where a kid was caught masturbating, and then they made, you know, with some sort of, I can't remember too well now, but the same sort of thing. But I always think these things rely on a notion that you've got shame or you've got enough status to be shamed. Because if you think about some Dostoevsky stories, you've got characters in that who are shameless, you know, Smerdyakov, people like that, who revel in their self-humiliation almost, you know. But that's a different
totally. It's totally, but that's where I mean, it's where you need to then have a character who is vulnerable to shame.
Yeah.
And that
I don't feel I am anymore, unfortunately. Which
no, so I think you'll probably be all right, Tim. So you can probably say what you like.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we better leave it there. Well, thanks very much, Nick. That was fascinating. We've gone way over time, but
no.
So so on behalf of
to
everybody, thank you very much. We'll see you in a few weeks' time. Yeah.
See you in a few weeks. See you in a few weeks for a bit of crime.
Yeah, for a bit of crime, contemporary crime. Yeah. You couldn't be more up to date with what you're doing now with your crime drama. Okay. See you then, Nick. We better get on to our next section. Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye. Thank you.